NATO defense ministers have recently, participated. I was also delighted to see that, and that's new to me, that the Munich Security Conference is now in the business of arranging marriages. I saw a little item in the newspaper the other day that Jake Sullivan, a colleague of yours, met his now wife while they were in the same hotel in Munich at the Munich Security Conference. And so I'm glad that we have this additional function now also. I want to start very briefly with the following thought. When I first served as a junior diplomat here in Washington, we were talking about the 3% goal, not the 2% goal. And the United States, in those days, regarded ideas in Europe that were cropping up here and there about an EU effort in security or defense as not a good idea. Really not a good idea, because it was thought that that would distract from the fundamental task of, supporting the joint NATO effort. And the point I want to make is, I think it's very important to note that that has changed dramatically. It is a total sea change. I think it is very important to recognize and to appreciate that the United States today, and several presidents have said it, most recently President Obama, of course, that the EU effort in this field is good, is being supported, and is being appreciated. That leads me, and that's great, that leads me to the following thought, and that is something that the minister from Norway, of course, couldn't say. I believe that instead of continuing what I believe is a rather fruitless debate about, which one of us is going to reach the 2% or 35 years ago, the 3% goal, I believe the right response for those of us who are members of the EU is to make a dramatic step forward in the direction of a European army. That's the kind of thing we ought to be doing. That's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen next year. But it needs careful preparation. It needs the involvement of our parliaments. It needs time. It is probably a generational project. But that is the kind of signal which I believe, if we started to undertake it, would be understood even in the Kremlin. And it would be understood as a signal of strength and not of weakness. Last point I want to make is, or two more quick points. One, role of NATO, in my view, and it's mentioned in your really very good report, which I had only a brief moment to look at. One important role of NATO that's often not mentioned enough is that NATO is the single most successful proliferation, preventer, non-proliferation agent in history. If we did, let me ask the question the other way around. If we did not have NATO, if we had not had NATO for the last, half century, does anyone think that Germany would not have gone for nuclear weapons? Certainly during the Cold War. Does anyone believe that Turkey would not have gone for nuclear weapons? In other words, the only reason why you have not had in the entire European theater a quest for nuclear weapons is the existence of NATO. And that's something that I believe is important to keep saying to our publics who do not often appreciate that there is more to NATO than just Afghanistan. And I'm sick and tired of listening to people in my own country who say, now that the boys are coming home from Afghanistan, why do we need NATO? I think there are many reasons, and I'm only mentioning this one non-proliferation reason. Last point, I do believe that we need to get Russia right. That is an important, continues to be an important job. And even if things look so much harder than most of us thought they would look 5 or 6 or 8 years ago, it's still very important to get it right. And I believe that our original approach in the early and mid-90s was not the wrong approach. I remember how Chancellor Kohl said to some of us as we were discussing Volker Rühr's first speech on NATO enlargement. Chancellor Kohl said, let me talk to Boris Yeltsin first. I need to find out whether we can work out something that they can live with, even if they will not love it. And the idea that then came out of these discussions, and which I believe we successfully implemented in 96, 97, at the first enlargement summit and with the NATO-Russia Founding Act, was the kind of a two-pillar approach. The NATO enlargement approach and the, building up an ever more intense and ever more substantive NATO-Russia relationship. And I believe that was in principle not a wrong idea. It hasn't worked as well as it was supposed to work, and that's certainly not only our fault, certainly mostly the Russians' fault, but that doesn't mean that the original approach was wrong, and we should try again and again and leave the door open. Russia is going to be, whether we like it or not, the direct neighbor of Ukraine and the direct neighbor of a number of EU member countries, and certainly a very important, I hope we can say, not adversary, but an important neighbor. Unfortunately, and you said it, and I agree, now not somebody we can actually credibly call a partner, and that's too bad. I'll stop here.
Thanks very much, Wolfgang. You raised some very important issues, which I'll want to come back to you on across the key points that you just made. Let me turn to Fabrice now for his thoughts on the shift that's going on in the world. There's the immediate agenda, the NATO summit in about 60 days, roughly, maybe a little more. But also, I think there will be some coming headlines that, as the head of policy planning in the NATO Secretary General's office, we would love to get your thoughts on where things are headed.
With pleasure, and I enjoyed so much the first meeting I attended in Oslo than when I got your invitation to come here today, and it was clashing with the foreign ministerial in Brussels. Obviously, I did not hesitate. So just for the record. Thank you very much for the invitation, and let me make 3 broad points to try to address your question. First, about the global changing security environment. I think we can draw 3 points from there. One is the arc of crisis that was already there has broadened and intensified. So the arc of crisis that stretches from Western Africa via the Sahel, the Middle East, to Central Asia is there, and it's becoming more worrying every day. Overlapping this arc of crisis, we see an arc of unstable deterrence, for lack of better name, which you can say stretches from the Middle East to East Asia, where you do see states holding weapons of mass destruction, missile technology, and yet there are no rules of the game. There are no rules to try to manage the risk associated with holding weapons of mass destruction. And to bring these 2 arcs together, what you see 6 years after the global recession is that multipolarity is full-blown. We knew about multipolarity before, but now it's there. And I don't think, in a sense, it's a problem. The real question behind is whether you have a multipolar world with one set of rules, hopefully the rules that were spelled out at the end of the Second World War and at the end of the Cold War, or whether you have a multipolar world with different rules. And I think this is what you see happening not only in Asia Pacific, between especially the US and China, but also now in the Euro-Atlantic area. So it's about not a race to make the world unipolar or bipolar, but it's a race to make the multipolar world sticking to one framework, some kind of open rule-based system. That's my first point. What does it mean for the immediate strategy or the immediate response of the alliance? Because obviously Ukraine is a significant crisis. My boss has called it a wake-up call for us all, and I think we cannot disagree with that. I think the one important point to make is that the strategic concept, which is our kind of strategic operating software, stands tested and valid. What is interesting in the conversation that often criticize NATO is you have not had a debate about whether the strategic concept is still valid or not. I think the notion of having 3 core tasks and being able to do all 3 at the same time still makes sense. The notion that we have to deal with conventional as well as non-conventional threats also makes sense. So we have the right software. Now, also, when you look at the crisis, I think despite the usual debate and maybe disagreement, in the end, NATO has shown, not NATO, the nations through NATO have shown a real capacity to rebalance their focus from what has been 12 years of large stabilization effort to a greater focus on collective defense. So the immediate reassurance measures that both the United States and all the European allies and also Canada have taken show that we can change our focus and we can adapt to the real world. And what you will hopefully see at the Wales Summit will be the heads of states agreeing with an alliance readiness action plan, which has been discussed as we speak today in Brussels. And this action plan will cover some of the points that were raised by the minister, and in a forceful way. And it will send an important message, which is to say we're not going to be a one-dimensional alliance. We're going to be an alliance that will be ready for any strategic surprise coming from the east, the north, or the south. And readiness is the best answer to strategic surprise. And this is why we're going to reinforce that. So this is for making the point that I think we are on target so far. Now there is a bigger question, and this is my third point, is what is the kind of longer-term role of the alliance in this competitive world? And I will make 2 points. One is I think it starts with what the nations want the alliance to do. We often forget that NATO is not a kind of floating institution detached from nations' preoccupations, nations' resources and priorities. It starts with the nations and it ends with the nations. So where the nations will put their money, where they will agree on NATO playing a role or not, will be, I think, the key factor. So that's why we have to take first a political take on that. The second, I would like to put forward for the debate a proposition about the future posture of the alliance, something we could call strategic flexibility. And I think this is obviously borrowed from the Nixon doctrine in his famous Guam speech, which was to respond to a difficult juncture moment for the US power with Vietnam and with trying to exert pressure on Russia without necessarily continuing investing to the same extent in defense. And I think the same concept could be nicely transposed to what NATO should try to become in the future. Let me just finish on that. First, strategic flexibility is about not being just a one-flank alliance. It's about being able to do different flanks, both north, south, east, and also being able to deal with, I would say, new domains like cyber. Second, it's not about being an on or off switch. Too long, I think NATO has often been regarded as either we do something, and often it's in a kind of high intensity, large scale, or we don't do anything and we don't even speak about it. And I think we need to go into a more kind of graded approach where we should be able to speak about things, we should be able to gain situational awareness, but not necessarily act. That decision will obviously always rest with the North Atlantic Council, but we should be able to have the political discussion before. And in our response, we should also not, and this is the third point of the strategic flexibility, it should not be all about kind of large-scale or high-intensity military response. We should be able to be more graded. First, deterrence. I think we need to rediscover the virtue of the deterrence. We're doing that, but we need to replace deterrence in a modern kind of forward-looking thinking. Second, crisis management can be done in very different ways. It can be done from the air, like we saw with Libya, but it can also be done by helping the others help themselves, by doing training, by doing advising. So I think NATO needs to kind of broaden its toolbox, but not just be a toolbox. It needs to be political before. And this is how I look at strategic flexibility. Just to finish on how I think we can do strategic flexibility. I think first, obviously 2% is important because it's political. It's about saying we are all committed and we are putting the treasure to our behind our political commitment. But what's equally important to make sense of 2%, it's priorities. It's especially European nations who obviously have more limited resources than the United States to be able to focus in those areas that really produce the highest yield, those capabilities that can really help in most scenarios. And we have seen from Afghanistan that the things we have invested in Afghanistan can be also transposed to collective defense scenario. So I would say that the future of strategic flexibility lies in focusing on those core priorities. Second, focusing the collective investment in the force multipliers. And I mean by that joint ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, the NATO command structure, and training and exercise. So putting the collective money where it can really multiply, I would say not only allow everybody to punch above their weight, but to deliver several punches at the same time. And finally, I think we need to become more political. And this is not just a generic point, but the strategic flexibility doctrine was about doing politically what maybe we could not do just by military means. Therefore, what I'm saying is that we should be able to allow the alliance, especially the future NATO Secretary General, to engage in real political diplomatic work. And that's obviously with Russia, where we need to reach a kind of new predictability in the relationship, but also with regional organizations like the African Union, who are more interested in taking the lead on operations, but don't necessarily have the capabilities yet to do so. And I think to have a more diplomatic stroke political alliance will allow us to help the others help themselves and project stability without necessarily projecting forces. Thank you.
Wow, Fabrice, that was the best rendering I've heard of NATO's strategy for this new world I think ever, so I really appreciate that. I have 1,000 questions, and I'm sure we'll be able to get to all of them, but really, really fantastic. Julie, we now want to turn to you in particular for your views on the impact of this changing world on U.S. strategic thinking. I know you've done a lot of work recently on that as well, so we would love to hear from you.
Sure, thanks. Well, first, thanks to the minister for the fantastic speech. It was music, I think, to all of our ears, and I think we could sit and listen all day to many of the proposals that you laid out. And I think we're all hopeful that under your leadership and others inside the alliance that we're finally going to make some progress on a lot of these challenges that we've been dealing with for quite some time. And I think that's one of the things I wanted to highlight, and that's one of the things that worries me in terms of what the alliance is doing right now. The alliance is very much focused in the face of the Ukraine crisis on tackling the challenges we've been outlining for 20 or 30 years. And so I'm hoping that we're going to eventually get at the heart of some solutions, again, through your leadership and the many good ideas that you and your colleagues are laying out. But I feel like NATO has been trapped in addressing yesterday's problems for quite some time. And if you had kind of a split screen version of the world, you'd have NATO on one half of the screen kind of operating in slow motion, and another NAC, and another ministerial, and another summit talking about 2% and modernizing our forces and figuring out what our strategic aims are and the balance between collective defense and expeditionary operations. These are all debates we've all been sitting in for decades. And then in the other side of the screen, you'd have the world on fast forward, rapidly evolving. And we don't even know what to call this world. Some people call it the post 9/11 environment. We know we're not in the post-Cold War. We're not in post 9/11. It's something else. we're having a hard time even capturing what it is. And this is a challenge for the US administration right now as well. I've, in a recent report, called it the era of compounding complexity. It's a bit wonky and nerdy, but I think it captures kind of this environment we find ourselves in where there's so much coming at us in terms of the challenges that the West faces, the fraying of the liberal order, the evolving nature of alliances, rapidly changing public opinion on the use of military force, the nexus between domestic and foreign policy. So many different things are evolving right before our eyes. And so it's hard for an organization like NATO to keep up. And that's what I worry about. I think Wales will put forward some very helpful, useful proposals on readiness, on resilience, on collective defense, certainly on partnerships, I hope. But it's not necessarily going to reflect where NATO sits in the broader world. And by that, I mean that the alliance really is facing a number of strategic challenges and a number of statecraft challenges. And I think Fabrice, just to echo what he said, is absolutely spot on. NATO's been trapped in this mindset for quite some time that, heaven forbid, if it actually starts talking about a region or a crisis or a conflict where it doesn't necessarily want to be engaged, then that's a bad thing, and that we should prevent that conversation from happening. And we've seen that instinct on Syria and other cases where the alliance has pulled back a little bit from sharing this collective wealth of knowledge, insight, intelligence, just situational awareness, because it worries that it's a slippery slope and it takes us right into some proper NATO mission or intervention. And I think we have to lift our heads up and allow ministers to sit around the table and occasionally have an unscripted conversation and not come with our 5 minutes of talking points and everyone reads them, but really let people share the tremendous wealth of knowledge that is often present around almost every NATO meeting. So strategically, I think we have to loosen things up a little bit and be a little less risk averse and take on some of these broader strategic challenges, have conversations about the Asia Pacific, have conversations about Syria and now Iraq, knowing that probably there's not a NATO role, and not worrying that by talking about the Asia Pacific, suddenly the US is going to be requesting ships to be sent into the South China Sea. It doesn't have to play out that way. And if we reach some agreement that dialogue isn't necessarily strategic dialogue, dangerous, then I think we'll all be in a better place to deal with what you talked about and the minister talked about in terms of preparing for strategic surprise. I mean, maybe we would have perhaps talked forever about Ukraine or Syria or what have you, or Iraq, and still had strategic surprise. So there's no telling what you can actually prevent by having at least some sort of dialogue. But I'd really like to see NATO catch up with kind of world developments and everything that's coming at us in this era of compounding complexity and deal with some of these strategic questions. On the statecraft side, I do think that the tools of statecraft are rapidly evolving. And we could go down a number of rabbit holes inside NATO, but to have a conversation among the NATO allies, for example, about disruptive technology and the fact that so much of this technology, first of all, the control resides in the private sector, not in the public sector. Our old mindset was that innovation, when it came to technology, always resided in the public sector. That's changed dramatically. We should be having a conversation as allies about that, about disruptive technology, also getting in the hands of very dicey actors and groups all around the world, and what that means for a potential NATO response, or how we grapple with that collectively as an organization. I think we also have to think about all of the new tools that have surfaced in recent years, things like cyber technology or UAVs, where we haven't adequately addressed the global norms arms piece and have a conversation inside NATO, but in other forums as well, about how we kind of provide some sort of international frame for all of this that will help us deal with the proliferation of these technologies and then developing our own sets of tools and rules of the road for the use of those tools down the road. And then lastly, I would say on the toolkit, I mean, where NATO is really going to struggle in the coming years is on this unconventional piece. I mean, I don't stay awake at night worrying so much right now about Russian tanks rolling across the Estonian border. I worry a lot about what Russia's going to do inside Estonia just short of that. So let's say we suddenly see a situation where a TV station is seized in Estonia, or again, passing out Russian passports. So we all know the Russian tactics, and Putin is extremely clever, and he knows just how far he can go short of a proper Article 5 NATO response, where there'd be huge NATO debates about, well, is this Article 5 or not? It doesn't quite feel like it. This is what NATO should be talking about right now. We do have to talk about Article 5 and deterrence and collective defense, but we also have to be talking right now about unconventional warfare and how NATO is going to grapple with the fact that countries are perhaps more clever than we give them credit for, not just the Russians, but others, about how to play just below that red line. And that's what I think NATO isn't prepared for right now, for both NATO member states and, more importantly, for those that fall in the gray zone between NATO territory and Russia. In terms of the US administration, I mean, Barry and I have had a number of conversations about this just quickly. I mean, a lot of what I've just outlined in terms of the strategic challenges and the statecraft challenges are perfectly in line with what the administration is struggling with. And I don't think I want to give anyone the illusion that the US administration has all the answers on this front. I think the next US president, whoever it is in 2016, is going to face many of these same questions, but will be better equipped to do it within a NATO framework and with allies, in some cases in the EU, in some cases inside NATO. But this is a conversation that the West should be having right now, not just in isolation, either in Washington or London or Tokyo or wherever. So with that, I'll leave it.
Great, thank you, Julie. Excellent concepts and ideas for us to be having and discussing as we go forward. Rolf, would love to hear from you, in particular, the Nordic perspective on all of these issues that have been raised.
Well, thank you, Barry. At least I can speak on behalf of myself. So, but your starting point was that there is a power shift going on, and that's, of course, a deep reality we are facing. But that has also led to the idea that we should define a new strategy for NATO. But I don't agree with them. The current concept of 2010 takes into account all relevant threats and risks. It's flexible, it's sound. This is not a time to invent new buzzwords and catchphrases. This is actually the time to act, to do things. And I shall try to elaborate on that, what should be done. Let me concentrate very briefly on 4 key priorities and additionally underline the need for a stronger US leadership. The first one, and the urgent one, is to renew the focus on traditional collective security, because there is a strong concern there in many countries in Europe. There is a need for deterring Russia and for reassuring member states. The defense minister talked extensively about this, so I leave it there at this stage. But the second key priority I would emphasize is how to manage the high-end part of the new or emerging threats. We are talking about traditional or transnational terrorism of the gravest kind. We are talking about missile threats in combination with weapons of mass destruction, a growing threat. Some nations in Europe have committed themselves to take part. Others should join for the sake of solidarity, but also to give extra strength to this effort. Next comes the Article 5 related cyber defense challenges. The concept of 2010 is a solid basis here, as it recognizes cyber challenges as major challenges, But we have to move beyond that. Again, we are at a stage where it is necessary to act, to improve information sharing, to develop contingency plans and capabilities, maybe establish a cyber defense force. And at one stage, the alliance will have to address the question of offensive cyber capabilities. I think that has to be a role for NATO. It will be difficult to sort out, but it will be part of the package. The third key priority I would mention is how to deal with the greater Middle East, from West Africa to India, where things are moving in the wrong direction again. It affects us all, but of course it's a more apparent challenge to the southern countries of NATO. Those countries that don't regard basically Russia as a threat, that face quite another security environment. There is a growing north-south divide in the alliance. Economically, of course, we have seen it for some years, but also strategically. So there is a bridge that has to be built between the regions and nations in NATO. And all countries in the alliance will have to take part in this effort, in fighting terrorism, in building nations, institutions, and capacities in these very volatile region. The third key priority is how the alliance should adjust to the rise of Asia-Pacific. My reading of the situation is that in the longer-term perspective, the Americans will reallocate substantial resources to that part of the world. And that's basically a good thing. It's in the interest of all of us, because it makes it possible for the United States to maintain its role as a global stabilizer. Also that it will keep on the role as the foremost guardian of a rule-based international order. But there are consequences for Europe. And I think we must gradually live with the fact that the American presence in Europe will be in the form of light footprints, hopefully in combination with concept for rapid reinforcements. That is a challenge, but I think that's basically enough if you can manage that package. But of course it raises the fundamental question that has been addressed by several people here today, including the defense minister, the need for a fundamental new burden sharing across the Atlantic. That's a part of it. 4 key priorities: traditional collective security, emerging threats, the greater Middle East, and the rise of Asia. Then we come to the delicate question, can NATO make it? And I think it can. But basically on one condition, and that is that US assumes stronger leadership, far stronger leadership. It's a sad fact that the United States does not longer shape NATO's agenda as it used to do. It doesn't exert a discipline as it used to do. Unpleasant at times, but I think necessary in the longer-term perspective to maintain coherence in the alliance. So that leaves me to the fundamental questions to you and to the audience. Could we expect strong US leadership in the years to come? Could we expect that the administration in Washington will make it crystal clear that the European part of NATO will now have to stand up and raise its defense expenditure? Could we expect this administration to be crystal clear when it comes to protecting some key multilateral capabilities, AVEX, AGS, and tell some of the countries that withdrawal is not acceptable, just to illustrate what is needed to move forward. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Tamnes. You really covered the waterfront in a very comprehensive way. Let me ask each of the panelists a question about a point or two that I've picked up from your discussion, and please everyone join in. We'll keep this lively. I want to return to Ambassador Ischinger, who I thought made a very important, among his many other points, made a very important point about the need for dramatic steps forward toward a European army. This is a generational challenge, and I think there's no one to sort of discuss Germany's role in that better than you. We would love to hear from you on where Germany is in dealing with this challenge. We know there were some very forward-leaning speeches at your conference from the most senior German officials, but the public and the will to actually move forward isn't quite there yet. Can you give us a snapshot of that, and how do you think that's going to all play out in the next five or so years?
I have no idea.
Thanks very much.
No, I mean, really, honestly, it's really very hard to say, and I'm involved in discussions in Berlin and elsewhere in how to move forward. It's very hard to say. It depends on the next election and the elections after that. But I think what almost everybody recognizes in the German debate and also in the debate that takes place in Brussels and elsewhere is that our way of spending the defense dollar or euro is not a rational way. We collectively, 28 member nations of the European Union, spend approximately half of what the United States spends. This means if you apply normal logic, that would mean that in terms of fighting capability, you would have to expect about 50% of the US. Most of the generals that I've checked with tell me that the EU collectively brings to the floor maybe 10%, depending on how you measure this. In other words, this is one of the least efficient ways of spending, of making a collective effort. And that is why, I think one of the first steps that we should take, and that these are steps that would not involve the very difficult constitutional questions of, can we entrust the question of deploying our troops to a in this case, non-German authority like the NATO Council or the European Parliament or some other supranational authority. The first step should be, in my view, more pooling and sharing, or as they say at NATO, more smart defense. What does this mean, for example? We have already started over the last number of years in some segments of the EU or of NATO efforts, for example, in air transport, where a number of nations have pooled their resources, and sure enough, you find out that the average hours of use of these aircraft has gone up tremendously. In other words, this is a more efficient use of your resource. And the nations who participate all of a sudden find out that when they need some transport aircraft, it's there, even if it's not their own, but a partner aircraft is available. So that's a good model. And it is beyond my comprehension why in an age of austerity and in an age of security challenge, 28 nations who have tied their fate together, some of them even by having a common currency, but all of them in the Treaty of Lisbon, which also has a kind of a security element to it. It is beyond my comprehension that we behave, and most of these EU member countries obviously are small countries with 10 million or less in terms of people. we behave as if we were still in the 19th century. Each of these countries has its own general staff. Some countries have navies that have more admirals than ships. It is ridiculous. I mean, if we want to be taken seriously, serious efforts at pooling and sharing in various categories, simply to provide models to build upon, I think that's the way to move forward. And then the ultimate goal can be the army. To come back to your question, within the current German coalition, as you know, there is the more conservative party, the CDU, and the SPD. The CDU has traditionally embraced in their party programs the idea of the long-term vision of a European army, and they have not abandoned it. So it's right there. It was endorsed again not so long ago, but the problem is no concrete steps are really taken above and beyond some of these initial smaller these smaller regional efforts. And my last point is, I was as pleased as anybody that at the Munich conference, President Gauck, Defense Minister von der Leyen, who was here last week, and even the foreign minister who comes from the other party, all agreed that Germany should be more proactive, should accept more responsibility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm waiting to see and to listen to the first speech in which Chancellor Merkel will endorse these very points. I'm sure that will happen at some point, but so far it hasn't happened. In other words, this has not yet been translated into a formally endorsed and implemented national policy or policy document. That's got to be the next step. And a footnote, one thing that needs to be changed, and I don't know whether there are other Germans here in the room, one thing that really needs to be changed in our approach to national security and to defense planning has to be that we need to write a white paper again, a fundamental planning document. The last German defense white paper dates from 2006. You know, this is almost a decade ago. And I think that would be one of the helpful steps also to educate our public about the kinds of questions that we're discussing here. So we have a big agenda to follow, but I'm delighted that these speeches were made and that we are now having a beginning debate, at least, in Germany about where to go and what kind of resources we need. And I like to say, thank you, Vladimir Putin, for reminding us that actually it's great that we have NATO.
With all respect for Ischinger, for Wolfgang, I think the question of a European army is a false question. I think first my first reaction is, what kind of army? Maybe European, but what, a bonsai army? So I think behind the question is something more complex, which you also touched on, which is, where is Europe now in terms of military power? And I just would like to dispel some few misunderstandings which are often here, not only in the US, but also in Europe itself. First, I think there are some silver linings. The Europeans got much better at using military power since the crisis in the Balkans. And many of you in the room can attest to that. Some countries could not perform night bombing raids, for example, during Kosovo, whilst during Libya, that was a different picture. The second point is, I think there is also a history. The European nations, the Western European nations, were required to have certain format of their armies with large land forces to basically absorb the Soviet Union's forces, which means it takes time to reformat forces. And we also have the new members, which had even more, I would say, preponderance on land forces. And there is, I would say, a historic background which you can't just forget in few years. And the final point is, there's not just one Europe. when we talk about military power. There are several Europe. There are those who are able and still willing. And they're still managing to be able, but it's a tough call. And I'm thinking mostly of France and the United Kingdom. Then you have those who are potentially able, but are not necessarily willing. And I think Wolfgang was mentioning the debate happening currently in Berlin, and that's why there's so much focus towards Berlin. And then there's those who are maybe have some kind of ability, some kind of willingness, but will not necessarily make a huge difference in the military balance, at least the European military balance. So there are several Europe. And the real question is, how do you bring it together to create a critical mass for Europe's sake, but also for the US to feel that they have a partner on the other side of the Atlantic? And I think strategic awareness, strategic culture is an important thing. We will not always see the world in the same way, from Berlin, from Paris, from London. This is obvious. But at least we can have some points of agreement that the East, but also the South and the North matter. And we need to be able to respond to all kinds of surprise. I think we also need to focus on not just 2%, but again, some 3-4 priority capability areas. Not everything. Pretending that we can do 15, 20 priorities mean that we're not going to do anything. So I think it's better to focus on few things, do them well, rather than pretending to do the whole game and not to deliver. And finally, to reflect on Rolf's point, I think collective investment in some key areas is where Europe, but also the United States, can punch above their weight. And for example, the NATO command structure, however it sounds like a structure and very institutional, is a key backbone. And next year will be the moment where the new command structure, after the quite fundamental reform that was undertaken over the last few years, will come into play. And I think it will be the judgment point as to whether the nations are really delivering the quality they promised to deliver. And my bet is that the new Secretary General will have to go to the nations and make sure that they are delivering the quality, that means the number of personnel, but also the qualified personnel, in order to make that smaller but leaner NATO command structure a real tool for everybody, the United States included. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fabrice. I want to come back to you. And I thought what was a brilliant rendition of sort of how NATO should navigate this new world. And you keep talking about the West, challenges in the North, in the South, and in the East. But I want to remind you where you sit. We are in North America. North America is part of the NATO alliance, and indeed there was an Article 5 operation, as you know, right after 9/11 here. And is it conceivable that if the United States or Canada faces a threat from the Pacific, that NATO would also pay attention to this threat? I'm not suggesting that the entire alliance shift its military forces to the Pacific at all, but we've talked about the importance of dialogue. Minister Sarita talked about the importance of U.S. attention in Asia and of European engagement in Asia. We have Norwegian ships near Hawaii as we speak. So how about the West? At least from NATO's point of view, is that anywhere in your concept?
It's a very good question, and something that was raised also by several speakers. What does Asia-Pacific mean for the alliance, especially for the European allies? And I think it's one that we should have in the coming years and come up with hopefully a convincing answer. And the way I see this answer is, first, we need to start having at least a strategic discussion about what is happening in the Asia-Pacific, what are the challenges, and what do they mean for the global balance in general. Second, if we don't go to the Asia-Pacific is coming to us. It's as simple as that. China is becoming increasingly an important naval power, not only in the Gulf, but also in the Mediterranean. China has an important footprint in Africa. So even if we want to ignore that part of the world is going to come to us. And I think it's important we are mindful of that. And finally, I think it's not so much about being in Asia-Pacific as working with Asia-Pacific. And I think partners like Japan, Australia, those partners who are basically with whom we have worked very closely, both in operation and at the political level, especially in Afghanistan, we need to keep them plugged first politically, but also in our interoperability, so that we understand how they view the world and how they view what's happening in Asia Pacific and the impact on the Euro-Atlantic area, and vice versa. And I think Ukraine is probably the kind of fusion point of that. It was very telling that we've heard from many Asia Pacific partners how they were reading the Ukraine and Crimea events, and how these events were very meaningful to them, and how, therefore, we should also look at what is happening in East Asia as meaningful strategic events for the Euro-Atlantic area. So I think, in a way, Afghanistan has kept us busy for many years. Ukraine, we had to respond, but now that somehow the dust is settling, my bet is after the World Summit, we will enter into this deep strategic discussion about what does Asia-Pacific mean. And just to finish, and I do think that the Europeans, at least some Europeans, can contribute symbolically but still meaningfully to what the US is trying to do in Asia-Pacific. And this is a conversation that hopefully we will be able to have within NATO. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Julie, let me pick up on one of your very many good points on the tools and the types of contingencies that NATO is likely to face. I think you called them unconventional, and we're obviously all thinking of what went on in Ukraine and Crimea. And it struck me, and this was discussed a little bit at the Atlantic Council Europe Whole and Free Conference, that the breadth and type of tools that Russia was using are not only not in NATO's toolkit, but some of them are in the EU's toolkit. Some of them are underused muscles from the Cold War, when we're talking covert operations, intelligence activities, a full range of instruments that just cut across the institutions that we have and then go beyond. And so do you have any thoughts? It sounds like you've been doing some thinking on sort of, does NATO need to expand its toolkit? Does NATO and the EU need to have a different sort of mechanism to deal with these types of crises where we're actually using economic instruments for the first time in my memory to deter military or paramilitary action by what I call the Russian pros, not the pro-Russians in Ukraine. And so what's your sense on the institutional machinery, or where sort of NATO ends and other institutions begin on this question?
Well, I think in the case of the situation with Russia, it does cry out for a whole array of tools that cross multiple institutions. And I wouldn't want to suggest by any means that NATO suddenly has to take all of that on. It would be wrong. And I think particularly on the cyber piece, that's where it gets extremely complicated, because there is capacity, institutional knowledge, and expertise. All sorts of regulations are being put in place. There is a home for cyber in the EU-US relationship. Well, just the EU alone, first and foremost, where it's obviously carving out its own course. But also there has been some dialogue between the United States and the EU, a significant amount of dialogue that's obviously impacted now quite negatively in a post-Snowden environment, which is another topic for another day. But in any case, there is a home for this type of conversation and for thinking creatively about what additional tools we may need as partners in that EU framework. At the same time, I feel like NATO does need to up its game a little bit in the cyberspace. To date, it's been able to successfully secure its own networks, which was an important first step. But above and beyond that, I think the NATO alliance has been a little bit skittish on even engaging in much of a dialogue about what types of tools might be provided by allies in the face of an attack that could be categorized as an Article 5 operation. And if we're not sure what could be categorized as such, we should also be having that debate. But it puts countries in very awkward positions, because obviously in the cyber arena, you've got everything from highly developed offensive and defense capabilities to absolutely nothing in some countries. And so the range of capacity there is so great. Obviously, there are certain countries that also don't want to share and reveal even what they have in hand. But I think this isn't unlike some of the very sensitive conversations we've had over the last 60 or 70 years about nuclear capabilities, we've handled sensitive issues before, and we've handled situations where allies bring a huge range of capabilities to bear. So I feel confident that the alliance should slowly but surely be able to take cyber on. But of course, cyber is just one piece of it. There's the strategic communications / messaging / propaganda, whatever you want to call it, piece where the U.S. government has struggled a great deal with this. State Department is experimenting with different types of messaging, using social media, putting stuff up on their website, counterfactuals to the Russian propaganda. But it's hard. It's hard to compete with a country that's exerting full control over the media. And that's just a game where we come at it with the losing hand in some cases. But this is something NATO should be discussing, the EU-US should be discussing, definitely on the strategic communications piece. And then there's the whole economic statecraft. This has great sex appeal right now. Everybody likes the ring to it, particularly folks in Washington, where we're in a climate right now where a lot of Americans feel like they want to reject the military instrument. They're looking for something else. Economic statecraft seems about right. But when we really get down to it, we're not exactly sure what above and beyond sanctions it actually means. You know, we know that we used economic statecraft vis-a-vis the Iranians with some great success in getting them to the negotiating table. We know we're now relying on economic statecraft, again, as defined as sanctions, with the Russians for their actions in Ukraine and Crimea. But thinking more creatively outside the box of what that economic statecraft toolkit should look like is also a conversation we should be having. And that's probably not suited for NATO. I think that obviously for multiple reasons should sit as it has in the case of Ukraine, primarily through an EU-US dialogue or selective members across Europe that want to play a leading role. The Weimar Group has been incredibly effective also in pursuing kind of their negotiations and political approach to the conflict. And so we should be open-minded. But your point is exactly right, Barry. I mean, this really has opened up, I think, our minds, I hope, to the variety of tools that we either lack or need to better develop to deal with a situation as Ukraine has unfolded.
Just a two-finger, if I may. I totally agree with Julie's point, especially on cyber, where we need to go in terms of a collective response. But just an important point on so-called hybrid warfare or asymmetric means and so on. As much as we need to respond to those and to probably come up with better or actually old response, like info ops, which we have partly dismantled within the NATO command structure that may have to be reinjected in the command structure, but it should not distract us from a basic fact that this is about the power exerting pressure on weaker or sovereign nations. So in the end, conventional forces, symmetric means, and this is what the alliance business is, matter. And hybrid warfare, as used by President Putin, is not efficient if it's not backed, in fact, by symmetric conventional forces. So I think this is just a call for the allies not to focus on, indeed, there's this new modern kind of asymmetric questions, but in the end, do your homework. Do the symmetric conventional bit, because without that, whatever you do in the asymmetric business will be meaningless. Thank you.
The challenges are additive as well as
Yes.
capabilities. I agree. I want to get to Rolf. One quick question to Rolf before we open it to the audience. I thought you laid out a very good agenda. It was a global one, the greater Middle East, other challenges. How does the alliance deal with this in a constrained resource environment? Do you have any thoughts on sort of dealing with this agenda? It could be quite expansive in terms of the resource needs.
Well, it's much easier for me to try to address that question than those who are in position, but let me try. The first is to focus, as you pointed out as well, and to identify a clear course. And as a part of that, there has to be a leadership. And the fact of life is that there is only one country that can offer strategic leadership in the alliance, and that is the United States. Germany, perhaps 10, 20 years from now, it's a long time to wait. So that's the starting point, the kind of leadership and the kind of an effort to focus. From that comes the ability, so to say, to prioritize. Because that's much of the challenge today. There is a whole variety of ideas and concepts and thinking about anything. There has always been a challenge when it comes to too many tasks. That's basically the fact of life. In such a situation, there is only one question that matters, and that's the ability to prioritize. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much. I want to open it to the audience. We have a lot of issues, a lot of questions. Let's take Hans Benedijk in the back and then Peter Wilson.
Thank you. I wanted to raise the question of European defense capabilities in the summit and what we might be able to do there to further that cause. The 2% goal would be nice to reconstitute, but it's a blunt instrument. Fabrice, you were talking about 3 or 4 priority items, which is good, but still small. And at the other end, Wolfgang was talking about the larger eventual vision of a European army. And I'm wondering if there isn't a goal somewhere between those two poles that we might use at the summit to begin to provide a vision of where we want European defense capabilities to go. And so my suggestion here would be a European level of ambition within the alliance. We have a NATO level of ambition. We don't have a European level of ambition. And a step in the direction of building priorities and potentially moving to a European army, there's problems with that, would be a European level of ambition, perhaps 1 major joint operation and 3 smaller joint operations.
Any of our panelists want to address European level of ambition?
I know this is one of Hans' always good points. And I think first there is an EU level of ambition, which you can say applies to at least most of the European nations. My concern with that concept, however good it is and however useful it could be to help drive the capability investment, is in the end, Article 5 means we are in it at 28. And if you start building some sub-level of ambition, you are basically starting to somehow split the notion of all for one and one for all. And I would have a concern with that. However, I think your question is very valid, is how do you steer the Europeans, however diverse they are and uneven they are in their resources, to create a greater European critical mass. And I think this is going to be the challenge not of this summit, but of this summit, of next year's EU Council Summit on Defense, of potentially the next NATO summit, to try to get, again, the Europeans to focus on priorities. And I think the enablers that have shown to be missing so much in recent operations, this is something like the air-to-air refuelers, the ISR, etc. This is definitely something where the Europeans need to do more, and they know they can only do more by working together, because very few of them have the means to invest individually in getting a critical mass of drones and so on. So I think priorities done in a cooperative way is the way forward. And finally, it may not be sexy, but I think it's very important, skills. One of the criticisms of Bob Gates in his speech when he left his duty was to say that not only capability gaps, but skills gap. That the United States during the Libya operation had to inject, I think it was 60 more planners in the NATO command structures because the Europeans could not provide those. So we need to get better into the skills race. And this can be done by doing meaningful training and exercise. I think NATO can do its part by using some of the common funding, but I think every nation has to commit more money to training their armed forces. Thank you.
Ambassador Ischinger.
Fabrice speaks the language of NATO and NATO experts. I understand this language, but I'm afraid to say it's not a language that's understood by most of our publics today. I'm sad to say, but it's true. So we need to make a huge effort for these types of reflections to be understood and supported. I would respond to your point, Hans, by pointing to an example, to a model which was developed in the EU as a response to the financial crisis. We introduced the idea of what is called in the specialized language the European semester. In other words, you as a nation, EU member nation, a Eurozone member nation, need to present your budget for next year to somebody in the EU in order to get the green light before you take this budget and let it be approved by your own national parliament. That's the general idea. Not everybody liked this because some people thought it was taking prerogatives away from the national parliaments, but it is, of course, if it works, a very interesting process to coordinate and to make sure that within this group of nations, everybody understands what the other partner is doing. In this case, on financial, on budget, on debt, et cetera, et cetera. Why do we not introduce this idea to NATO? So my proposal would be instead of dreaming of the 2% goal, which most NATO nations, it's easy to predict, will continue not to meet, unfortunately, let them or let us decide at the summit that we will introduce, the NATO semester. Each nation presents their defense budget to a collective, auditor, an auditing committee, and that would at least help us prevent the kinds of surprises that we've been exposed to recently when all of a sudden, at least as far as I'm concerned, out of the blue, for example, we saw that the British defense budget was plummeting for understandable reasons. But I think we need a process where the individual NATO nations know what the other nation is planning and what it is not planning. And that would also enable us to at least start a more meaningful process of pooling and sharing, my principal thought that I wanted to introduce here. Because if one nation on its own decides to eliminate all artillery or all tanks, and there are nations in the EU who have done that, then maybe it's a useful thing for the others to be informed of these plans before they're actually eliminated, so that a thought can be given to maybe somebody else can bring in this tank artillery capacity to balance things out, so that at the end of the day, those who are in command politically and militarily have better oversight. So I think this would be one useful step, both in the direction of pooling and sharing and also in the direction of budgetary discipline and coherence.
I think Julie wanted to...
I just wanted to add, Wolfgang's absolutely right. We actually inside NATO have a defense planning process that is supposed to function this way, but it's been broken for a long time, and it's unfolding exactly the way Wolfgang outlined, and that is when I was at the Pentagon responsible for monitoring the budgets of 30-some countries across Europe, some in NATO, some not. In theory, we were supposed to get the feed from our colleagues at NATO saying we had a meeting today, country X came in and said, newsflash, we're going to be eliminating this capability. How does that feel from a NATO perspective? Because we can tell you what's motivating us from a national perspective. And so that was how it was supposed to work. We were supposed to have this kind of dialogue. What happened instead is either country X would skip the meeting, not really present the facts, not lay out the decisions that they were grappling with, or in cases where they were courageous enough or brave enough to do that, they'd take the feedback. Maybe NATO would respond and say, hold up, if you get rid of that capability, that really puts the alliance at a disadvantage and adds some vulnerability to our national security posture. Then they'd say, thank you very much for your interest in national security, and they'd walk away, and then they'd still take the decision. And so as a bureaucrat sitting in the Pentagon trying to monitor this, I mean, there were literally instances where we were opening the newspaper and we were reading about decisions that were unfolding in national capitals across the alliance when we should have gotten a heads up inside NATO. Now, to be fair, the US doesn't use this process either. So I don't want to give anyone the impression that the US is always willing to walk in the door and reveal all. There have been instances where we've been better about it and other cases where we've been terrible about it. But the fact of the matter is this process, as Wolfgang noted, needs to be completely turned on its head and revitalized. We have to reestablish the trust to have this conversation, and there needs to be some sort of feedback so that you don't get the surprise of your neighbor a couple of miles over suddenly revealing that they're going to get rid of a whole set of capabilities that you may feel you might want to have collectively.
Very quickly, I agree with both of you. And I think you describe in very non-NATO lingua a very complicated process, which is called the NATO defense planning process. Yes. Could not do better. I think what we're lacking is not planning. What we're lacking is accountability. And I think accountability can help us kill two birds with one stone. One bird is puts more pressure on the nations. Not name and shame, but more peer pressure for nations to really deliver on what they say they will do and explain why they are cutting certain things, etc. Accountability also helps us to make a broader case, which you were absolutely spot on. It's about defense, why defense matters. And it's not about why NATO matters, because it's much more fundamental. It's why to the and also to parliamentarians, because they are key individuals in the whole decision making. Why do we need defense in the 21st century? And I think this is a discussion that we need to have in Berlin, but also in London, in Washington, and so on. So I think accountability, being more transparent about defense spending figure, is something we owe to our citizens, but something that will help us explain to our citizens why, in the end, we're not spending that much, but we're getting a lot in return. Thank you.
Rolf.
When I listen to you, it reminds me of the simple fact that when we look back at NATO's history, it has always been in a crisis. There has always been deep shortcomings. And today's situation is no exception. At the same time, I would indicate that I sense a certain movement today in a certain direction, a situation that wasn't there a couple of years ago. And that gives some hope. At the same time, in my head, there is always a fallback position, and that is enhanced bilateral and unilateral cooperation between selected countries. But that's another huge subject, which I suppose we will have to leave for another seminar.
Thank you very much. I'm so upset that we're out of time. I just have to do two things. One, recognize two ambassadors who are here as part of our family, Ambassador Loic, the Estonian ambassador to Russia, and Ambassador Bisogniero, the Italian ambassador to the United States. Thank you for coming. Also, I have to say, this was the most forward-looking, insightful panel on NATO's future that I've ever seen. I don't always do this, but I'm going to go to the tape later and study this, because there's a whole rich load of analyses that I think need to be done from the concepts that the four of you have outlined here. I really mean that. So thank you, Rolf. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Fabrice. Thank you, Wolfgang. And please join me in thanking them for an excellent discussion.